Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Andrei Marinescu with us. Andrei, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Bronson.
Absolutely. You've done some pretty exciting stuff, and I think our audience is in for a treat listening to this interview. In case they don't know of you, previously you were the CMO at Viddy, you were the VP of Marketing at MOG, and you were in charge of customer acquisition at a little company called Hulu.
Yeah, that's right.
So you've done quite a bit here in the last few years. Let's just jump right in. Each company I just listed is very media oriented with either music or video, but they're also different. MOG and Hulu really leveraged licensed media, where Viddy was more centered around user-generated media. And I want to talk about those differences for a minute, because some people watching this are going to be involved in media that's user-generated, and others are going to be involved in media that's licensed. So I think you can kind of shed some light on that. What unique growth challenges do you face with license as opposed to user-generated, let's say?
Yeah, it's a good question. So they're both very different animals. And besides growth challenges, there's some fundamental business differences that I should touch upon. And I think anybody who's working in the space probably realizes this already. But with licensed media, obviously, the content is not yours. So you're going to another entity and striking licensing agreements, which means that that can usually take some time. Occasionally, it'll involve some hard-nosed business development negotiations. So that's part of the challenge. The other part of the challenge is obviously you're paying for that licensing. So traditionally, licensed media businesses tend to be relatively low margin. That affects the future of your business. It affects the multiples that anybody who's thinking about acquiring your company would deal with, and it also affects you on the marketing side, because with limited margins, that constrains what you can do in terms of discounts, marketing programs, so you can pay for customer acquisition costs, etc. Mm-hmm. Also, with licensed content, since you're not the owner of that content, you have to defer to the rightful owners in terms of what you can actually do from a marketing perspective. Yeah. And we saw this a lot at Hulu, where with current TV shows, which is the cornerstone of Hulu's offering, mm-hmm. you ideally want to use the stars the same way that the studios and the networks that are promoting their shows do, but that can be challenging. So you have to rely on other approaches to structuring creative. So when you're talking about display advertising, for instance, or anything visual that represents the content, it can be really tricky. You have to go and get approval from the studios. You can't come up with your own creative, so it creates some constraints. Yeah. But on the other hand, with licensed media, you're getting a certain quality of the content, which is helpful, and you know that you're generally getting new content. So when I was at MOG with music, new music comes out every Tuesday, right? So by virtue of the structure of the system, you know that you have something that you can reach out to your existing users, to new users, to entice them to come in and sample your product, which is the content. On the video side, with Hulu, since our focus was on current TV shows, every week there'd be a new episode, there'd be a new season. So lots of opportunities to engage users via email marketing, via banner campaigns, via even SEM and whatnot, because you're constantly having a stream of fresh content. So those are some of the key challenges. There's also something to consider in terms of the user experience, right? So whenever you're marketing, you have to think about your product. And if you don't have a great product, it's that much harder to get people to come to use your product, and even more so to get them to pay for it. Mm-hmm. So generally, for most software, web service businesses, et cetera, when they talk about product, they're literally talking about the software. They're talking about the user experience. In a business like Hulu or MOG, for instance, the product really means both the content and the Chrome, if you will, around that content. So that gives you kind of twice the challenges, but also twice the opportunities to market.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think what you said about the financials kind of rings true to me, because a lot of people hear about the Spotify stories, the Pandora stories, that they're just trying to eke out margins despite having all this market share. So I totally hear what you're saying about, when you're dealing with licensed media, you're really restrained with, what you can do and what you can't do. And all the other stuff you said is awesome as well. And let me ask you a little bit about user-generated content. I know you didn't spend very long at Viddy, but you know the industries pretty well anyway, just because of all your experience. Some people assume that user-generated content is going to be easy to acquire, that people are just dying for a new platform to invest in, that they, to spend hours, generating their content for them. How hard is it really to do a user-generated play for a startup?
I think it's probably, it may be independent of the actual content aspect, right? So it's as hard as any other product that you're trying to put together. If you have a great product that addresses a tangible pain point that a lot of consumers have, you will see that reflected in use and adoption of the product. If your product misses the mark, you will also see that reflected in usage, right? So getting users to create content using your tool or your service, certainly challenging. But if you can come up with the right experience, if you can tap into the zeitgeist, if a lot of it is luck, a lot of it is preparation, hard work. Mm-hmm. But just look at Instagram, right? Instagram seemingly came out of nowhere. Certainly those guys worked very hard at putting together a really compelling product and user experience, and they were in the right place at the right time as smartphones and smartphone cameras were getting better and better, and users were kind of looking to transition away from the traditional digital camera experience, and they seized upon that moment and saw just tremendous amount of growth, which is still going today, obviously. Before them, Flickr, back in the mid 2000s, saw similar experiences. So it's certainly doable, but again, you need to create a really great product.
Yeah. So this might answer the next question as well. When you say it comes back to product, and you don't really want to focus on whether it's user generated or licensed, it's just, does it fill a need? Do people actually care about it? The zeitgeist kind of stuff. If you were starting a company tomorrow, knowing what you know now, kind of working with a lot of licensing and a little bit of user generated, which space would you rather compete in? Do you have a preference?
Can I say none of the above?
Yeah, you can. Why is that? Do you just want
Well, I'm being facetious more than anything else. Personally, if I had to pick between the two, I would tend more towards user-generated media. And for what it's worth, I'm still very bullish on the mobile video space, right? So whether it's Viddy or Vine or some other as yet unannounced player in the space, I think that there will be sometime probably in the next year or so, there probably will be some sort of a shift where consumers will get more comfortable with the notion of shooting video that they share publicly, and users will get more comfortable with creating fun and interesting, compelling, and creative content, and there'll be a rise in those sorts of applications. But just with licensed media, it's so challenging because, again, you are not in control of your own destiny, and ultimately, every entrepreneur has to think about an exit strategy, whether it's going public or being acquired by somebody. And in the case of the latter, since realistically there aren't that many companies that really make it to IPO, in the case of the latter, if your business is structured around licensed media, it makes it really hard to sell the company, because anybody who's interested in acquiring you will most likely have to go back and renegotiate those content licenses. So that makes you much less of an appealing acquisition target, and even if you are acquired, the price that you will get is probably much lower than you would otherwise.
So you also helped, like we said earlier, launch and grow Hulu Plus, and tell me if I'm wrong, into a 3 million subscriber business with $500 million in annual revenue. Is that right?
So when I left at the end of 2012, we were just past 3 million paying subscribers. Those are the publicly released figures, and our annual revenue run rate was in the $500 million range. Now, keep in mind that's both subscription and advertising, since it was a dual revenue, or it is a dual revenue stream service. But yes.
What growth lessons that you learned at, let's say, MOG, did you apply to Hulu Plus? Were there any, since they're both kind of in licensed media, or was Hulu Plus just a completely new animal for you?
There were similarities and differences. So I think the main lessons coming away from MOG, they really didn't have that much to do with licensed media per se. It was more just around the fundamentals, which basically include anything around analytics. They involve conversion rate optimization, as some people refer to it, basically figuring out your acquisition funnel, making sure that you're thinking through your landing pages right, that you're doing A/B testing, that you think about the copy and the messaging. That's probably the one biggest similarity, I would say, between MOG and Hulu, is trying to figure out how to get out of your own headspace, being so familiar with the product and the service, and figuring out how to describe it in a really easily understandable fashion to the average consumer, so to speak, who maybe at the time wasn't familiar or comfortable with the notion of streaming music as opposed to buying music. And in the case of Hulu, also with the notion of an on-demand streaming service as opposed to ad hoc download like iTunes, or even the notion of watching TV shows on outside of the traditional television cable box environment. So there are a lot of those kind of messaging challenges were shared, but also just the fundamental foundational work that you have to do to get things started on the right foot.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your initial strategy for customer acquisition during the launch of Hulu Plus? Kind of day one, right out of the gates, what was your strategy to really get user adoption?
Yeah, it's a good question. So with Hulu, we had a very significant advantage and a benefit, which was that Hulu had started years before I joined as a free-to-consumer service, right? So we essentially were moving from a free-to-consumer to a freemium type of model. And because of Hulu having such a great product, they had huge traction in those early years. So we had the benefit of an install base of 20 to 25 million monthly uniques who were coming to Hulu.com to consume free content. And so that was the first area of focus for us, is how do we drive awareness of Hulu Plus to this audience? How do we upsell them into Hulu Plus, make them aware of the incremental benefits, which really revolved around getting access to the content on other connected devices besides your computer, so tablets, living room devices, smart TVs, gaming consoles. And the second benefit was also that you would get more content. So you'd get full seasons of certain shows, you'd get some shows that weren't available at all in the free service, etc. So that was really the main thrust, is with this big of an audience, which essentially you could acquire for free since they're already on your site, how can we do the best job of messaging them about Hulu Plus and doing a nice, nuanced, contextual job of upselling them?
Yeah.
Also, in the early days, frankly, we didn't have a lot of comps to go by in terms of understanding what the lifetime value of our customers were, being confident how long subscribers would stick around. So we looked at Netflix, obviously, and some other comps, but nothing was perfect. And so we wanted to be aggressive, but also strike a somewhat conservative tone and not go out and spend a lot of money on customer acquisition before we really knew what we could afford. So consequently, the focus was on the upsell of the existing users, kind of a second area of focus. And just to take a step back, when Hulu Plus started, it basically rolled out as a private beta for somewhere around the order of 6 months or so. So it was during that time that we really focused strongly on doing all of the landing page work, conversion funnel optimization work. So we had these users in the beta who we were kind of using as a test case to understand what worked and what didn't. And then when the service launched publicly, we were obviously continuing to do that sort of conversion rate optimization work on the site and looking at funnels and landing pages and messaging. But we also started focusing a lot on partner marketing. So we had a lot of OEM partners. So these are all the folks who are making the electronics that had the Hulu Plus application on their software platforms. And so these were folks, everybody from Roku, who makes a streaming media player, to the Sonys of the world, to the Vizios of the world, people who were making gaming consoles, televisions, and Blu-ray players that were connected, etc. And a lot of these folks, because at that time, this was in late 2010, connectivity was a big selling point for a lot of these electronics manufacturers. And so Netflix had been on their platforms for a while, but given our unique value proposition around current season content, they were very keen to get Hulu Plus on those platforms.
Yeah.
So as a result, not only did we develop apps for those respective platforms, but these partners came in and were very eager to work with us to do co-marketing promotion. So for example, if you were to go out and buy a Roku streaming player, you would get a free month of Hulu Plus. If you were to go and buy a Sony PS3 gaming console, you'd get several months of Hulu Plus to go along with that. And so that was kind of the second wave that we really focused on for customer acquisition in the early days, which is leverage these partnerships leverage the fact that some of these partners are willing to include us in their marketing initiative. So we're talking about TV spots, we're talking about print collateral, we're talking about online, and then eventually even shifting into retail where they wanted to include us alongside them in the stores. And that was a huge benefit for us because essentially it allowed us to draft on the marketing budgets to some extent of these much larger players. Yeah. And once we got through these early days, let's say once we were about 6 months into the public launch, we started getting enough data on how subscribers were performing in the service. So what the conversion rate was, how long people were sticking around, what the churn rate was, to feel comfortable with the assumptions that we were making about how much we could spend on customer acquisition on an individual basis. And so once we got to that point where we had that degree of confidence, then we started going out and investing in the paid channels. So we started out slowly by doing testing with SEM, with display marketing, and then as we started seeing positive results there, we started spending more and more and gradually increasing the efficiencies of those channels over time, then gradually moved into affiliate marketing and some of the other paid acquisition channels.
Yeah, man, there's so much there I want to talk about. You listed out so many great things there. Let's start with kind of, you said you wanted to reach the initial audience, right? What was that early messaging like? Was it an email that you sent to them to get them that landing page? Was it ads inside of Hulu to get them to the landing pages? Was it all the above? What did you learn about really the initial kind of getting in touch with them? Because you were in a unique spot where you had 20 plus million people, like you said, kind of waiting for you to tell them what's next. So what did that initial reach out look like?
Yeah, it was interesting. So for a number of various reasons, the appetite for email marketing was very low at Hulu in the early days.
Really?
Yeah, and so that was a battle that we fought for a while before we convinced everybody that it was worth going down the path of doing email marketing for customer acquisition as well as retention and then reacquisition, obviously. Mm-hmm. So in the early days, a lot of our messaging was really focused around what we could do on the website. So we had the landing page for Hulu Plus. We had messaging across the rest of Hulu.com that was somewhat contextual. So, for example, every show, every episode of content that we have in the service has its own dedicated page on the site. And so on those pages, if there was content that was available in Hulu Plus as well, we would have a message, basically an upsell message to that effect on that page. So for users who are not Hulu Plus subscribers, for users who are not signed into the service, they would see a little message, a little upsell, basically telling them that, hey, this show is only available in Hulu Plus, or you could watch more of this show in Hulu Plus, or you could watch this show on your iPad or living room device, on your gaming console, whatever. Mm-hmm. So we did a number of tests and iterations on that messaging. There were also other graphical elements across the site which we played with to try and drive awareness of the fact that some content was only in Hulu Plus. Mm-hmm. And so it was a big learning experience, and looking back at those very early iterations of what our landing pages look like and our messaging, it's very cringeworthy, but I think that's kind of a standard experience for most folks. At the beginning, you have your certain assumptions that you go out there with that you want to test, and what you usually find is that you're not that close to the mark, and you have to kind of go back. And so we did our best to iterate as quickly as possible on some of that messaging, and we started going out and talking to consumers, doing market research against both subscribers and folks who hadn't subscribed yet, or folks who maybe weren't even aware of Hulu, to try and get an understanding of how they thought about television content, understand how receptive they were to Hulu Plus as a general service, and then try and hone in on how exactly we should message it. Because, the fact is that we make a lot of assumptions about people's general comfort level with technology and their understanding of it. But the fact is that outside of a relatively small subset of people who work in the space, the general public really is not, isn't as comfortable or maybe even as savvy about some of the terms even, right? So this notion of streaming versus downloading, which to people who work in tech, like, of course, that's a no-brainer difference that you can explain easily. But to an average user, what we found is that wasn't so readily understandable, right? So this notion of downloading of, okay, I'm buying something, then I have to wait for it to download on my computer, then I can watch it, versus I just click a button and I can instantaneously start to watch it. So I think that's changed a lot in the last few years as Netflix has gotten bigger and focused more on this streaming service, as Hulu Plus has ramped up. Obviously, Amazon, a number of other players have come into the space. But in those early days, we struggled with that. Even the notion of the cloud, right? Like as we were thinking about messaging, we're thinking, hey, should we try and position Hulu Plus as like your television in the cloud, or TV shows in the cloud? And we stayed away from that partly because we were afraid that this concept of the cloud was something that was still very novel and not familiar to most folks. So, but to go back to your original question, a lot of the early focus in our messaging was in terms of what we could do on site. Later on, we started doing email marketing and using that as well as an acquisition tool.
Yeah, and then you also mentioned partnerships. And you talked about how you're essentially leveraging their marketing budget for your brand, because you're doing something with them, and they're putting your logo here and your logo there, and they're giving away a free month, in their platform. Do you think startups underutilize partnerships? In my mind, they're magical. Do you think startups generally understand how powerful partnerships can be?
So I think that's a fair point. I don't know if the average startup has a full appreciation of that, but I think it's also challenging for many startups to explore partnerships. I mean, we were very lucky in many ways because at Hulu we were at this perfect intersection where Hulu had developed a really great brand. Almost despite of itself, right? Because there had really been no tangible investment on the marketing side because the economics just didn't bear it. So there was an early ad campaign in the Super Bowl, and that was partly through the investment of one of the networks. It was basically an ad credit that we had received, but there had been no other investment on the marketing side. So Hulu had grown purely by word of mouth, but had done so very quickly and kind of garnered a place in kind of the mind space of a lot of consumers. And also for the consumer electronics industry, obviously, as they're trying to maintain the value of their products and trying to stay away from them being just dumb electronics that were commoditized, this notion of connectivity was huge at the time, right? This was in 2010. And they knew that consumers were looking for alternative ways to consume video besides the traditional way of subscribing to a cable provider. So they were very receptive, the OEMs rather, were very receptive to this notion of working with us. Now, I don't know if that necessarily translates to a lot of other startups. I can tell you when I was at MOG, even though we had what we considered a really great service, our brand recognition was arguably very low. And so we were pursuing similar types of strategies in terms of going to OEMs and trying to do deals to get MOG installed on their various platforms. And let me tell you that the traction that we were getting there was significantly lower than at Hulu. So it really comes down to who you are and how well you're known in that particular space. So yes, I think partnerships can be very powerful, but they're not always easy to get if you're a young startup.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you've mentioned kind of your existing user base, 20 plus million. You've mentioned the partnerships. You also mentioned affiliates. You kind of showed us some of the things you guys started with and kind of how it evolved. Overall, your time there, what was kind of the goose that laid the golden egg? What was the primary customer acquisition channel, if there was one?
So I would say that we were really focused on a whole slew of customer acquisition channels, and mostly this was because our goals for the service, right? So even though our initial success really, quite frankly, was much higher than even the most optimistic internal folks had anticipated it, our expectations quickly kind of rose to those levels as well. So we set some pretty aggressive growth targets for ourselves in those first couple of years, and even today the growth targets are pretty aggressive at the company. So as a result, we had to really focus on a bunch of acquisition channels, and we couldn't afford focusing on just one. Now that said, the user base, the existing Hulu.com user base was and even to this day, is a very good acquisition channel for Hulu Plus. Why? Because they're the most qualified people. They're the ones who've already used the product, if you will, in a simpler semblance. They buy into the value proposition of the company, and you're basically just trying to get them to take that next leap to get their credit card out in order to gain access to the service through other connected devices, which, again, it's also the timing, again, is critical because fewer and fewer people these days are sitting in front of a computer or want to sit in front of a computer to consume, right? They want to either consume it on their TV, or in most cases they want to consume it on their tablet or potentially even on their smartphone when they could be in a variety of locations.
Yeah.
So for that reason, that channel was always a great one and is still a very solid one today. Similarly, the partner acquisition channel, also very good. Why? Because those users are self-selected, right? So if you are, for example, a Roku customer, right? You have a Roku streaming box in your living room, it's because you love watching video content, right? So Hulu Plus is practically a no-brainer offering to you. And if you're already subscribing to Netflix and ESPN and whatnot, Hulu Plus just makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And so again, we saw lots of volume through those channels. Gaming consoles, a lot of people don't really use gaming consoles just to play games anymore. It's about consuming a lot of other content as well.
Yeah.
And so consequently, those turned out to be very good acquisition channels for us, both because they're large user bases of gaming console owners out there, but also because it's the right audience, right? Those folks are looking for other things to do, watching content, getting entertainment and whatnot. And so those made a lot of sense. And, some of the other channels, including the paid acquisition channels, also performed very well in terms of driving a lot of volume. Obviously more expensive than some of the more qualified channels, but overall our strategy, our customer acquisition strategy, was pretty diverse in terms of the number and types of acquisition channels that we were going after.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the paid acquisition channels, because I'm having a hard time trying to imagine what keywords you would buy against, because people don't go on there saying, searching in Google, I want a cloud-based TV service. You know what I mean? I want streaming TV, or maybe they are. I don't know. Are you targeting a certain kind of person and the kinds of things they would search for, and hope that it spills over onto your ad and they click? What was that like?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So while people may not search on cloud-based TV service, they will search on last night's episode of Glee that they missed.
Okay, I gotcha.
Or they will search on watching TV on my Xbox, for instance. And so those were the types of search terms that performed well for us. And also, frankly, a lot of people do searches on just the Hulu brand term itself, which I think happens a lot. So we are leveraging those types of searches to drive people into our acquisition funnel for Hulu Plus. There are a bunch of other types of acquisition strategies that we're focusing on in terms of SEM, but those are the ones that tended to perform really well for us, and I think they do similarly for other companies. This, though, again, comes back to your earlier question about licensed content. I think one of the advantages is, again, it's ubiquitous and people know the content, right? So you don't have to make somebody aware of the fact that there is something like Family Guy on your service. People know what Family Guy is, but there are also a ton of other companies and other players who are trying to leverage Family Guy content, whether it's literally watching it or presenting you metadata about Family Guy, or in the music world, metadata about an artist or an album or whatnot. And so SEM, for instance, can get very competitive and get very expensive. And so, again, with paid acquisition, it's a double-edged sword. You can drive a lot of volume that maybe you don't get through other more qualified channels, but it can be expensive, and if it's not expensive, it can get expensive as more people come into the space and compete for the same search terms.
Yeah. Now, before this interview started, I kind of assumed that Hulu had a huge, marketing budget. After talking to you, my guess is the margins were a little bit slimmer, and you had a marketing budget, but it wasn't, astronomical or anything. But I think it's fair to say that your budget was probably a little bigger than most startups, so we'll say that at least. Do you feel like having a budget to where you can have an extra credit and do a Super Bowl ad, or you can spend some money on paid acquisition, you have those kind of things at your disposal? Do you think it makes growth, 10x easier, or does it really just come down to fundamentals and it's not as big a deal as people assume. What's kind of your take on that? How much does having money actually matter with growth?
So money definitely matters, and it definitely helps, but it can also be a crutch of sorts. And certainly, you're not going to get as much of an efficient uptake just by spending money. So just if you increase your spend by 10x, the returns are definitely diminishing. Yeah. So on the one hand, it's nice to have a marketing budget like that because, again, with paid acquisition, you have access to potentially an unlimited amount of prospective customers. The fact is that the larger the audience that you're going after through a particular paid channel, the chances are that they're less qualified. So it'll cost you more to bring them in, and they're less likely to stick around for a long time. Yeah. And that said, again, with paid acquisition, it's a zero-sum game because there are only so many searches being done. There are only so many banners that people look at and click at. So as it gets more competitive, prices just naturally will trend up over time. Yeah. So I think the challenge with paid acquisition is that it can sometimes make you lazy even when you're unaware of it, in that you just say, well, we're just going to spend more, right? And that tends to be kind of the first off-the-cuff reaction is, well, if we need more subscribers, we'll just up our spend in this channel or that channel. And sometimes that's just the way it is, but other times focusing on paid acquisition takes away from your willingness or ability to focus on other things you can do, say around the actual product itself, product marketing, or thinking about features or elements of the product that can make it inherently more viral. Things, for example, like a referral program, where you can harness your most enthusiastic and passionate users to basically evangelize on your behalf and to bring in subscribers for you. And so that's the trick, is that there's only so much time and so much attention that you have, and so sometimes with paid acquisition, it takes you away from making some of the harder decisions and doing some of the more harder thinking around what you could do to generally improve the product.
Yeah, that's great advice. I hope people heard what you just said. Now, you're also an advisor at 500 startups, and yes, people can also consult with you through clarity.fm. So you interact with quite a few startups, on a regular basis. What are the most common questions that startups ask you? I'm just kind of wondering, because here's the guy that helped grow Hulu Plus. What are they coming to you? What do they ask you generally when they have a chance to ask you something?
Well, I think most people, when I have, let's say, less qualified conversations like initial kickoff meetings or whatnot with folks, a lot of them tend to have, the first-time entrepreneurs, or if they're just starting out with their new venture, they tend to have kind of fundamental questions around growth, right? So usually they haven't necessarily created a structured framework around their thinking. So they're just trying to figure out, where do they start, right? Like, how do they take the first step? And so it's the fundamental stuff that they tend to be trying to figure out, whether it has to do with analytics, whether it has to do with how to even think about email marketing, for instance, how to deal with paid acquisition. This is what a lot of folks tend to ask about. And again, I don't mean to be down on paid acquisition, but I think a lot of people kind of jump into thinking about paid acquisition right away, when the fact is that for early startups, paid acquisition may not even be viable, right? Because they may not have the funding or the ability to scale the funding to the point where they can drive a meaningful volume of new paying customers through that channel. And also the fact is that you'll see is, if you're going out there and doing paid acquisition with a partner like a Google, for instance, there are certain efficiencies that you can realize with a partner like that at significant scale, right? So once you're spending, let's say, 6 figures a month on SEM or display or whatnot, then that gives you access to some of the tools that Google will have, it may just be a matter of data, right? Like getting enough data points to really understand where the pockets of optimization lie. And so those kinds of budgets are just not realistic for a lot of early stage startups. So, folks tend to come to me with those types of questions, and I tend to encourage them, think more basically about the product and how you can get just initial growth around your most passionate users through just product marketing, viral features, et cetera. And yes, definitely think about paid acquisition, have that be part of your strategy, but realize that may not be the first, second, or third thing that you do.
Yeah. Now, I think you probably just answered my next question, but I'll ask it anyway, just in case there's something else you want to add. What do you wish more startups understood? Because I'm sure they come to you, they ask you their questions, and you're just like, oh, why do I have to repeat this every week? Why don't they get this one thing about growth that I just find myself being a broken record about? Maybe that's the paid stuff you just talked about. Maybe it's the focus on the product you just talked about. Is that the case?
So I would reframe your question a little bit differently. I think one of the core challenges that almost every company has, and this doesn't even apply solely to startups, even large companies, is underestimating the critical impact of decisions that they make around analytics. So that includes everything from how they structure the database on the back end, how they capture different behaviors and how those kind of map to each other in the database, to what sort of analytics service they use, whether they build something in-house or whether they use a third-party provider of analytics. Most companies tend to use Google Analytics because it's free and it's a good way to start. But the challenge is that it can be sometimes hard for Google Analytics to give you the types of actionable metrics that you really need. Yeah. And so I would say that that's another major pitfall that's also in the analytics arena for most startups, is really knowing like what metrics are meaningful and actionable. Because it's very easy to implement Google Analytics and then you see this very beautiful dashboard and you see all sorts of lines moving up and down and you see numbers that are in blue and red and you're seeing like, wow, I'm really understanding what's going on, when in fact it's very easy to get deluged by those numbers and lose sight of what's really meaningful and impacting your business.
Yeah, that's great. And if you're not tracking the right data early on, you may not have access to that data later when you really need to analyze it, when you really need to see what that funnel was doing. You don't have access to it to really understand it. Where do you find yourself pushing companies? Are you pushing them into Kissmetrics, into Mixpanel? Do you say you should probably build something in-house? Do you have a go-to kind of platform beyond Google Analytics, or does it just really depend on the business and it's anything that's more powerful will work for you?
I think it depends on the business. It depends on the team, particularly the technical folks and how savvy they are, what their inclination is. Ultimately, I think most companies that get to be successful and get to scale, unfortunately, will have to build out at least a portion of their analytics needs internally, because there's only so much you can do through third-party tools. And even some of the most forward-thinking companies that are developing analytics tools will not be able to custom tailor something specifically to you. So there really is no great substitute for having a well-structured database and a really smart database engineer and just running your own queries to understand what's going on. But that said, I think Google Analytics is a good starting point. Kissmetrics is a great tool. Mixpanel is a great tool. There's another one that I've come across recently called User Cycle, which also looks very interesting in terms of trying to help you combat this issue of being overwhelmed with vanity metrics and helping you kind of zero in on defining your most critical performance indicators and creating a dashboard and visualization system around those. So I think there are a number of tools out there. I think everybody just needs to do their research in depth around that and kind of figure out what works best for them.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, maybe because you see so many startups, what are some startups that have caught your attention that maybe aren't well known? Maybe they're not household names, they're still early stages, but they're doing it right. They're growing the right way in your eyes, and they're just making really good decisions about user acquisition. Do you have any companies that come to mind when you think about that? It's a sad state of affairs if you don't.
Well, I think there's a lot of coverage in the tech press, right? So I'm not going to pretend that I have any insider knowledge that you're probably not already reading about between TechCrunch and Pando Daily and The Verge and all these other great publications that are out there.
Yeah.
There are some startups that that I know that I'm working with who are doing a good job. But I think there are a lot of them overall, right? So I think, especially in the last few years, as it's gotten cheaper and cheaper to get your own venture off the ground, that's brought in a lot of folks and kind of convince them to give it a go on their own. And certainly there are a bunch of people who are trying and flailing, but I think that there are also a lot of smart folks who are kind of figuring out. And what impresses me is the fact that no matter how jaded you may be on a particular space and feeling like, okay, this has been done to death, inevitably, sooner or later, somebody will come along and just create a new product in that space it just takes off, right? And you can look at Dropbox as a great example at a point where there are already a bunch of cloud-based backup services, and they just came in and stole the show. Instagram, another great example of a service of, hey, everybody thought that the photo thing had already been done to death, and they kind of reinvigorated it. So I think that there are always opportunities for startups to kind of emerge out of the pack and take the lead.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's what I love about startups. There's always a chance that it's going to work.
Yes.
Now, you also invest in a couple startups each year. What do you look at when a startup comes to you and they're pitching you or whatever? I know what you're thinking about. You're looking at all the different aspects of their business. What do you focus on to decide, does this have real growth potential? What are some of the red flags? What are some of the things that really get you excited? Like, okay, I might invest in that. That has the thing I'm looking for. What goes through your mind? Because your filter is probably pretty strong on what to look for.
Well, so I'm certainly not going to pretend that I'm any sort of amazing investor. If I was, I'd probably be sitting on that side of the desk. But what I tend to look for, so I generally focus on consumer businesses, and that's mostly because that's a good way for me to apply my own gut check, right? Figure out if this is a product that I'm excited about as a consumer, as a user. Do I find it engaging? Does it work for me? Does it not? So that's certainly one filter to consider. The standard filters around the team, right? Do I like the folks on the team? Do they seem smart and sharp? Have they done it before? I think second or third time entrepreneurs, that's always a good signal that they know what's going on. They've been through it. And then it's also just the marketplace, right? So are you in the right place in the right time, right? Are you doing something that is, that stands a good potential to take off because a lot of people are focused on it. Now that can go both ways, right? If you look at e-commerce, there was a huge boom in e-commerce starting a few years ago, and now it seems to probably be mostly out of favor with a lot of institutional investors. So you can't pay too close attention to the trends, but you need to be aware of the macro trends, right? Like, so these days it's simple stuff like mobile and things of that nature, right? Whereas a few years ago, I think not everybody would have agreed that, hey, mobile is the area to focus. I think these days it's pretty cut and dry that there are a lot of interesting opportunities around mobile. So generally things like that.
Yeah. Well, Andrei, this has been a great interview. I have one last question for you because I actually called you to get advice before starting Growth Hacker TV. And
yes,
a lot of your advice came back to the experience, the end user experience, what the consumer actually feels and what they're actually going through using the service. How important is experience to user growth? Tell our audience a little bit about how important experience is overall.
I think it's hugely important. So if you have a product that doesn't resonate with your users, they're just not going to come back and use it, right? So then you're moving towards a dynamic where your marketing efforts turn to more of trying to put lipstick on a pig than anything else, right? Which it's a big headwind that you have to struggle with. The better your product, the easier your work as a marketer is going to be, because people just get it naturally and they want to use your product. You don't have to necessarily beat them over the head to have them come in and use it. And personally, I'm a big fan and proponent of the lean startup methodology. So the whole notion that Steve Blank developed years ago around customer development, going out there, understanding who your customer is, what their pain points are, how you're going to address those pain points, and building your product in a very, let's say, humble way, right? So it's not about what you want, but it's rather what your users want, and building an MVP, a minimally viable product. So not investing a lot of time and effort, but get something together that's usable, put it out there and test it, right? And just put it in the hands of people, see what they say. Do they like it? Do they not like it? What else would they like to see in the product? What else have you not thought about before that you're seeing people try and do with the product? So I think those types of kind of very tight cycles of putting something out, testing, measuring, going back and tweaking, I think those are very important to getting the product right, and those can have a huge impact down the road. And it's really, you're kind of laying your foundation and kind of setting your destiny. I think a well-built product that is well thought out and that is built around the customer is basically an investment that's going to pay back in dividends in terms of customer acquisition and retention down the road. A product that is poorly built, that's not well thought out, that is built on on suboptimal technology stack. Those are all decisions that are going to create hurdles for you that are going to slow you down as you try and scale and continue to grow.
Oh, that's great advice to end on. Andrei, again, thank you so much for coming on the program. I know our viewers are going to love this episode.
Thanks so much for having me.